The website you see here, www.mass.gov/2050 roadmap, is the place to go to get the reports if you haven't gotten them already, to stay up to date with what we're doing with the roadmap analysis, and to learn more. We are working on getting a web-hosted presentation of all of the results, the data. So if you want to understand how much offshore wind did the roadmap suggest we need in 2035 in scenario A or B, you can find that. It's public information, and it only works for the Commonwealth if everybody has access to it. So what is the 2050 roadmap? Well, the report pictured here is the culmination of 2 years of technical analysis using the very best models and analytic tools available to explore in detail what steps the Commonwealth and the region need to take to achieve our climate goals. I'll talk more about this in a bit, but it's important to emphasize that the roadmap analysis is 100% focused on implementation. How do we achieve net zero? What do we need to do today, tomorrow, in 5 years? And this is really important to understand and have confidence about what we need to do next, today, tomorrow, in 5 years. We need to understand this entire journey. This is really a transformation. We know we can do it, but it isn't we know we can do it. We know the broad outlines of what to do, but transforming the whole economy in 30 years is not an easy task. So the roadmap does it. It gives us this vision. It shows us the options we have, and that's really important. But it also shows us the types of actions that we must start taking now. Today, you'll see a lot of graphics pulled from the report itself, and that was intentional. At the end of December, we published almost 1,000 pages of analysis, which is already proving to be a great resource for planning and action across the state and across the region. So again, today will be an introduction to that. I hope if you haven't seen the report after today, as you go through the report, you'll recognize what it's talking about and sort of be able to get through the material better. There's a lot of material there. First, what was the roadmap designed to do? Well, it was designed to answer this core question. It's a tough question. How can the Commonwealth achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions while maintaining a healthy, equitable, and thriving economy? So the study wasn't just about cutting emissions or just about achieving net zero. It was about doing those critically important things while keeping the Commonwealth strong. That second part, while maintaining a healthy, equitable, and thriving economy, is absolutely critical. This year, we've seen a lot of disturbing things. And one, unfortunately, is the human tragedy that a major economic disruption like COVID can cause. Losses of jobs, of homes, of businesses, retirement savings that the pandemic has caused across the world and here at home. So making this transition, not at all costs, not at any cost, but affordably and smartly, is critically important. Again, for at least two reasons. One, I just mentioned, and I'll come back to. The other is getting to net zero will require a strong economy. We'll need to build and install thousands of wind turbines and solar panels and replace millions of vehicles, large and small. Develop new systems for pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. We'll need to retrofit millions of homes. So we need a strong economy. But as important, this administration is committed to doing that equitably. We need to transform our energy system while we're protecting everyone, including those who are most vulnerable. So how do we go about answering that question? Again, not an easy question to answer. I'm not going to pretend that we have the easiest road ahead of us, but we have a road that we can travel together. I want to explain our overall approach first, and then I'll discuss very briefly the tools we used. What we're really trying to do, again, is implementation, and to enable smart policy design capable of meeting our overall goal, we need to understand the fundamental physical requirements and technological options for achieving net zero. It isn't enough to say We know we need renewables. We know we need clean energy. We need to know more than that. And we really wanted and felt we needed to understand that landscape so we could develop options for us all to consider, particularly around some key elements like offshore wind, building heat, transmission, so that we could come up with robust strategies. I've said this before in other presentations. I want to emphasize, this was not an exercise to predict the future or to plan out 100% of everything that everyone has to do every day for the next 30 years. Both of those things are impossible. But by looking at a range of scenarios, all of which can achieve net zero in 2050, and that's our collective goal, we can learn what's likely to work, what's likely to not work, where there's opportunity, and where there's risk. So to do that, we used backcast modeling. And this is really the only way to do this kind of analysis, to answer the questions that we asked. And instead of starting with the world as we know it today, we started with the world in 2050 that we need to achieve. And from that, we worked back to today to understand not what is the lowest cost way to move around the state or heat a building today under today's architecture and rules, but what's the lowest cost way to make sure that in 2050, we can all take our kids to baseball practice, get to work, and have a warm home in the winter. Last, data. I mentioned before the roadmap is focused on implementation. It is, and it was, and it is. So we required our technical team to produce actionable data, not just statements about we need more clean electricity, or we only looked at the next 5 years, but we can't figure out anything beyond that. We wanted to know their best estimate using the best tools available, how much we'll need this year, how much we'll need next year, what kind of generation we need, what kind of vehicles, how do we make sure all that's reliable? The roadmap delivers those kind of answers for buildings, for transportation, for electricity, and for a range of other important pieces of our economy. The report talks in depth about the tools we used to do this. We are 100% transparent on the models we used, on our assumptions, and on our results, on all of it. What I want to emphasize today is that we built our analysis on modeling that looked at Massachusetts, not in isolation, but in the real world, as part of New England, and as part of what I'll call the Northeast mega region for energy. That's New England, together with New York to our west, and Quebec and New Brunswick to our north. Just like our highways, our energy systems do not stop at our state borders. We are already, today, deeply interconnected with all of those neighbors, and we're better and stronger for it. Also, our modeling was working this problem, if you will, across the entire economy simultaneously, balancing emissions, demand, and cost across transportation, electricity, and buildings, all at the same time, hour by hour, year by year, all the way out to 2050. And that's really important that this was done cross-sector, all emissions, all sectors, because as we decarbonize, those sectors, which today operate fairly independently of one another, will become more and more closely linked. I mentioned a moment ago that we felt the need to develop multiple strategies, multiple pathways to 2050, and here are the ones we looked at. Again, the report goes into each of these in detail, but for today, it's enough to understand what a pathway is. It's a complete and reliable picture of the what we need and the timeline we need it on to keep our economy going while we cut our greenhouse gas emissions further and further year after year. We've been doing that here in Massachusetts. We've been leading the nation in decoupling our economy, which has been growing since 2008 when the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed. Our economy has been growing and we have been cutting our emissions. So this is something we know we can do, and we're going to continue to do it. We looked at 8 scenarios or 8 pathways, more than any other analysis like this has ever looked at. And this is a first ever for Massachusetts and New England. Each of these pathways is a pathway to success. We did not model failure. Each of these pathways can achieve our collective net zero goal. What we did find, and this is why looking at multiple pathways and thinking about strategies rather than about picking what we think is our favorite going in, we found that some of these pathways look like they'll cost more, some will cost less, some look like they'll cost a lot more. Some carry risk with them that we have to rely on things happening outside of Massachusetts in parts of the country we have no control over. Some carry less risk, some involve the promise of delivering more local jobs. All of those things are important. And now, after looking at these 8 pathways, we have a good feel for how the dynamics of the system can work, which lets us, as I said, aim to build robust, reliable strategies for decarbonization. Together with all of these technical elements, people were a key part of our analytic approach. Ensuring that we can achieve net zero equitably was baked right into the DNA of the roadmap study, as was sustained stakeholder engagement with the general public, with environmental advocates, with businesses and utilities, with scientists and academics. And the conversation and engagement is not over. It's really just begun. Now let's talk about getting to net zero. Here are our top findings, and they're both straightforward, if you will, fairly simple, and they're incredibly important. The first is that we have demonstrated that we can achieve net zero in 2050, an incredibly ambitious target, one of the most stringent targets in the world, but also the target that scientists are telling us we need to achieve. We can do this while continuing to thrive. We can do it as a society affordably. Doesn't mean we don't have any cost. It doesn't mean it'll cost less than it costs today. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But our best estimate right now is that we can do this, if we're smart about it, for about the same amount of money we spend on energy region-wide every year. And that's billions of dollars that we all spend collectively every year. And it's shifting that investment from one set of stuff to a new set of stuff and shifting it over smartly. Over and over, we saw opportunities where investment today can deliver savings tomorrow and every day after it. And it's investment. Investment takes upfront capital. That's something we're all talking about. And we know that not all of us have upfront capital. Some of us have no capital, right? But if we make smart investments, we can expect a positive rate of return, which means it's worth it, right? We can buy something today that makes it cheaper to operate and live tomorrow and every day after. And we saw across pathways undeniable health and equity benefits from achieving net zero. This enterprise itself is critically important for delivering health benefits and outcomes, particularly to those communities that are today overburdened by fossil fuel production or pollution. Some of the overall strategies, getting a little bit deeper, those were some of our findings. They're really these 4 key components that we call the pillars of decarbonization or deep decarbonization. That's shifting end uses, things that use energy, cars, furnaces, shifting those things that do work for us, keep our drinks cold, move us from one place to another, those end uses, shifting them away from fossil fuels to clean sources, a lot of electricity, deploying more and more energy efficiency and also flexibility into, we call it the demand side of things, the ability to shift thermostats and not just turn a power plant on or off, but help shift load, whether it's shifting when and where we might charge an EV or when our hot water heater turns on in the morning. We need a clean energy supply to power all of those uses. And we see the least cost power supply that we can have is one built on clean electricity from a lot of renewable generation. And then this 4th pillar is new. Our previous 80% by 2050 goal only required us to cut emissions. A year ago, Governor Baker directed us, committed Massachusetts to achieve net zero. And last April, my boss, Secretary Theo Herides, set in law net zero as our legal limit. So we need to both achieve emissions reductions of at least 85% below 1990 levels, and we have to pull as much carbon out of the atmosphere in 2050 as we put into it. That's called net neutrality or carbon neutrality, net zero, and that's what the science requires. So looking at those 4 key themes or components of what it takes, we see that we need to reduce emissions. We need to change the things that are using fuel right now, either get a new heater or a new car, or in some cases, the same component, the same piece of equipment can burn a cleaner fuel. Not a lot of that, but that's part of the equation. We're shifting to a low carbon energy resource across Massachusetts. And again, we need to ensure that we pull as much carbon out of the atmosphere as we put into it. Something I'll talk a little bit more about the electricity sector, but overall, we have a number of great graphics in the report that show overall transition. And this is one that I know a lot of people are rightly aware of and very concerned of, because we know that it's the burning of fossil fuels to power things that's the problem. And so how are we going to do it? So the energy side of this equation is critical. But what we see and what we hear can chart now with real clarity and assurance is the kind of transition away from fossil fuels to using more and more electricity. On the left here, you see energy demand by fuel. One of the interesting things here is you see the overall energy demand decreasing as we grow our population and grow our economy. And that's the first ever across the world, this transition. We would normally expect growth to increase the amount of energy we need. Here, because so many pieces of clean equipment are more efficient than their fossil fuel counterpart. An electric vehicle car is far, far more efficient than a car powered by gas. And if by efficient, I mean it takes less energy in the tank to turn the wheels. So that total throughput, the same thing with heat pumps. So we're going to be using less energy because we're working more efficiently while we're getting cleaner. We definitely will need a lot of clean electricity to power that electricity heavy energy system. And so you can see here the growth of solar and wind year by year out till it's clearly the dominant resource in 2050. Imports are important too. It's not just because we're Massachusetts and we always import energy. That's a story people like to tell. It's because we learned that the most reliable system built on wind and solar is one that's shared with our neighbors, one that is, when the sun is shining in one state and not in another, we can share power. Same thing with wind and hydropower as well. Another really key finding, and I'll pause here for a second, is that the pace of transformation is critical. And it's critical for maintaining affordability. And as I said, maintaining affordability, we think is critical for ensuring that we can transition equitably. It's also important to ensure that this incredibly important transition doesn't overwhelm the entire economy. My kids are young, they're in school, they're in public schools. There are lots of things we need. We have public health, public schools, there's lots of things we have to fund. This is by far one of the most important, but it's not the only thing that's going on. So we need to do this as smartly as possible. But the real driver is that when we looked at where emissions come from, they come from things like our very own passenger cars and trucks. 60% of our transportation emissions come from personal vehicles, essentially. And 60% of our emissions in our buildings come from about 2.5 to 3 million, 2.5 million residences. So most of, and that's what on the right you're seeing in blue, a huge portion of our emissions are coming from businesses, but really small businesses. And a huge portion of our transportation emissions are coming from, or our transportation and building emissions are coming from households. We've already shut down our coal plants. We've already started to clean our electricity sector more than any other state or any other region in the country, except potentially California. And so this is really our next challenge, is transitioning millions of cars, retrofitting millions of buildings. And we're confident we can do it, and we can do it cost effectively. But the way to do it cost effectively, while again, keeping us all able to go to our jobs and doing everything that we need to do, is by paying attention to when things come up for replacement, and then making sure that when somebody needs a new furnace, they know they can get a heat pump. There's a heat pump available. There are heat pump installers who can transition them if that's their choice. I want to pause a minute, just very briefly, to ask you, invite you to see yourself in 2050. Right. 2050, after achieving net zero, our air is cleaner inside and out. Our homes are more efficient. They're more comfortable. They're cheaper to operate and own. They're more resilient to storms. Our vehicles are quieter and cleaner. They're cheaper to maintain and drive. And we've created thousands of jobs across multiple industries. That's a Massachusetts that I'm excited to live in and raise my kids in. And I hope you are as well. So we've talked a lot about strategies already, or I have, and the roadmap report talks about strategies. And I hope you're starting to understand why. We know the future is uncertain, but we also have no doubt about our need to achieve net zero in 2050 and to get there equitably. And so we're looking at developing, and we have developed, and the report talks about strategies that are robust, flexible, and resilient, that can change as the world changes, that are open to change. I often get asked, but what if nuclear fusion works? And my answer is, that would be wonderful. We will welcome it. Our strategy, this administration is committed to clean energy markets. Those markets would readily accept any new transformational technology that can do it cheaper. So we're talking about strategies. I'm going to go through this sort of a table of contents for the next few slides, touch briefly on each of these sectors and some of the top findings, and then we can open up the floor to some questions and answers. So light-duty transportation, as you can see at the top, almost 30% of our emissions statewide come from our own personal vehicles. Again, that's pretty critical when we talk about that transition, is how that works for businesses and families who are the ones that are driving those minivans and cars and trucks and crossovers. We found that for this class, and this is why this analysis was done with care, all transportation isn't the same, and all decarbonization solutions aren't the same. But for light duty transportation, these again are cars and trucks that we see on the road all around us, and most of us operate. It looks like electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles, will be the cheapest option for most families, for most owners, for most drivers. The technology is well advanced. There are lots of new models that have been announced and committed to for as soon as 2023. And we're seeing models available on all ranges: trucks, cars, buses, crossovers, you name it. To do this, to have a lot of electric vehicles, we know we'll need chargers. We'll need them at our homes, at our workplaces. We'll need them across public spaces so that people without home access, for example, have a place to charge their vehicle. But we're also seeing costs dropping here and battery performance getting better and better as manufacturers turn what really is an awesome engineering power in Detroit and across the world to the development of affordable zero emission vehicles of every size and type. There's a similar but slightly more complex story for medium and heavy duty transportation and for aviation and shipping. Here we expect to also see a lot of electrification. Maybe 50% of our medium and heavy duty roadway vehicles, buses, delivery trucks are electrified as well. But these categories, medium and heavy duty, freight, aviation, shipping, there are a lot of very job specific vehicles here. Think dump truck versus a 747 aircraft, right? And so for many of these more complex job specific vehicles, we expect hydrogen produced from clean renewable electricity or liquid carbon neutral biofuels to be the best option. And that's going to be something that these are mostly commercial vehicles owned by businesses, and that's going to be something that they're going to, I think, have to pick and be allowed to pick the least cost option. So I want to pause here for a moment. There's some data on each of these slides about the business and health benefits that we've found in the roadmap analysis in each sector. The medium and heavy duty and light duty transportation numbers are shared, but really the benefits that we see from widespread electrification in transportation are staggering. And they're staggering in the best way. These are health benefits, these are avoided deaths, this is less sickness, less asthma, less lung disease, millions and millions of dollars of savings in our healthcare system. And that's for all of us in our healthcare insurance, for those of us who are lucky enough to have it, and the creation of jobs. So that's we'll see that in every sector, but particularly the health benefits and the cleaner air from decarbonizing our vehicles is worth noting. Residential and commercial buildings, there's really sort of a similar story here as I just relayed with transportation. And it's not a story that we went into the report in order to tell, it's a story that comes out of the analysis. It's something that I learned from this analysis, and I've been focused on deep decarbonization for about 5 years of my professional life now. So what's a similar story? Again, about 60% of our emissions in the building sector come from residences. So these are homes, your home, my home. For these buildings, and I took it out of my notes, but I'll say it anyway, I sometimes jokingly call these relatively small boxes. Homes are wonderful. They're relatively small. They're relatively easy buildings to understand and decarbonize, at least for engineers. And for these buildings, electrification together with what we call a deep energy retrofit. So this is more insulation, better quality windows. With those together, electrification looks like it will be the least cost decarbonization strategy for most homeowners and businesses. For larger commercial buildings, say a large office tower, a hospital, a sports arena, the answer is a bit more complex. So as in transportation, a lot of those uses are job specific, varying sizes, varying profiles. We think a lot of those buildings will also be electrified. And what do I mean by electrified? Any of their office space, their hot water is likely to be kept warm and cool by a heat pump or a heat pump water heater or solar thermal panels on the roof, like this house that has both photovoltaic in that sort of L-shaped, and then in the upper right corner of that house on the bottom, there's solar thermal to preheat water. So we'll expect to see a lot of that across the commercial buildings, but we'll also, this is a place where we would expect to see the possibility of zero carbon gas being used or biodiesel, depending on the application. We had a few questions in advance about air source heat pumps. Things like, did we consider them running both in the winter and in the summer to heat and to cool? The answer is yes, absolutely. That's a great benefit that one gets from a heat pump that you can't get from a gas furnace. And we also, very importantly, took that load into account as we were designing and building, or the model was, our electricity system. So we have great confidence that we can power a clean economy that has widespread building electrification, and address all the things people may want to talk about: summer peak, winter peak, load, variability. We now have confidence that we can do that. We've shared this data already with our grid operator, and they are thrilled to see the level of detail that is attentive to reliability and those important questions. Someone asked, what was the coefficient of performance we used? I can't tell you right here, but it's in the report. And we used well-vetted coefficients of performance for the best air source heat pumps that are available today, because that's what we expect to go in, is not something that was manufactured and installed 5 years ago, but we expect people to be buying new heat pumps and putting in the best they have. And then this is important. Throughout the analysis, we advanced our technology in a very cautious and reasonable way. We've seen the price of cell phones drop over the 10 years that I've owned one, at least. We've seen the price for, or the cost of solar panels drop over the last 10 years. We've seen the price of a car drop over the last 10 years. So we use generally the estimates from reliable scientists at the National Renewable Energy Lab and other places like it. We vetted those locally with our own academics, and we went out to industry, for example, on solar, and said, how are these numbers? Are these good numbers for New England? And we confirmed that they were before we put them in the model. There's also a question about the cost of heating with an air source heat pump versus heating with natural gas. And that's an interesting one. All of our analysis shows that it might take a little bit more upfront capital, again, investment upfront to buy an air source heat pump. But what you get with it is something that's cheaper to operate from day one and for the life of the home, or the life of that heating system. And with an air source heat pump, you get cooling. And that's important, because even as we achieve our net zero goal, the world is warming. As a world, as a globe, we are a little behind the 8 ball, and that's an understatement, on addressing climate change. We are already experiencing climate impacts. We are already experiencing stronger storms, warmer summers. So heat pumps can help us be healthy and resilient as we stop climate change from going any further. Electricity and energy, one of my favorite topics. We could talk about it all day, or I could, but I won't. What we're seeing is that we are really lucky that we have an amazing offshore wind resource right off our coast, and that we've tested this, and we have confidence that we can build a clean and reliable energy system that uses a lot of offshore wind. But understand, we are not putting all our eggs in one basket. What we really found is that a diverse portfolio of solar, onshore wind, offshore wind, the existing clean facilities we have in hydropower and nuclear, all of those resources together, interlinked by transmission across that Northeast mega region, that is what gets us an affordable, reliable, clean, ultra clean electricity system. Somebody asked a question about whether we really are confident about our ability to trade energy with our neighbors to the north in Canada. And the answer is yes. I think a lot of people would be surprised at learning how long and how deeply interconnected we are with our neighbors to the north, and how well we get along with them. And we trade energy both ways every day. We trade energy into Long Island, we trade energy into New York City. This is what happens day to day, and it's the reason that our system is so reliable, is that we're interconnected. There was another question about the difference in our report indicated between the all options case, which was one of the lowest cost cases, and the 100% renewable option, which was one of the higher cost cases. We can talk more about that, and I invite the person who asked that question to follow up for details. But we found that it is possible to potentially power our entire economy with 100% renewable fuels. So 100% renewable liquid fuels, gaseous fuels, electricity, everything. But there are a lot of risks that come along with that. And it turned out to be one of our highest cost options, maybe costing as much as $3 billion a year, every year in 2050 for that pathway to net zero. And I promise I'm almost done. I'm probably, my team is probably like, we told you to go for 30 minutes and we're at 44. So we looked across the economy. We looked at non-energy and industrial emissions because those are important. They're in our inventory and they go into the atmosphere. Luckily, they're a relatively small part of our emissions in Massachusetts. And one thing that's interesting is this is one of the places we expect to see, these are some of the emissions that will stick around till 2050 that will need to be compensated for with pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. There, on this slide, there are 2 of the 3 pictures are of wastewater treatment plants. And that's not by accident. To have a clean wastewater treatment system that goes through our sewers from our homes, that creates methane, cleaning that water, and so there's certain technical realities of things that we don't know how to do yet without producing emissions. So in these areas, we can apply best practices. We can we're working to limit the growth if we can, to push industry to use the most efficient methods. But this is one of the areas where we'll have what some people call residual emissions by 2050. Maybe by 2100, we'll have a way to get rid of them all. But in the next 30 years, there'll be emissions coming from this sector. We also, for the first time, looked at natural carbon sequestration and carbon sequestration in general. And we are blessed in Massachusetts with having a lot of protected land, a lot of forest. We have about 3 million acres of forest in Massachusetts. We did a lot of analysis with scientists at Harvard Forest, some of the best scientists there are. And our estimate right now is that if we can preserve all that forest, grow it, and preserving it over 30 years with climate change is a challenge in and of itself. But if we can, it looks like that might be able to provide half to 2/3 at most of the carbon sequestration services we need, pulling that carbon out of the atmosphere to compensate for those emissions I just spoke about that we don't know of a way to otherwise get rid of. So that's really fantastic. It also means that we'll likely need more sequestration than our forests alone can provide. So, you know, together with a lot of the entire Northeast, we're blessed with forests. There are states that have very little forest and don't have this option that we have. So I'm almost done. I just want to situate the roadmap in some other things that are going on. You see that report again in the middle in green. It's a long-range analysis. Again, the whole purpose of this was to inform near-term action. This is not analysis for analysis' sake. I am not a professor. I'm not an academic. I am in charge of climate policy for Secretary Theoharides, and policy is about action. So the roadmap has a summary report, which I just summarized, and then there are 6 sector reports, if you will, that go into at times nauseating detail about all the work we did here and all the numbers we ran. We used that roadmap, this forward-looking vision, to help the secretary, to advise the secretary on what an on-pace, on-track, getting us to net zero target is for 2030. And she set that limit at 45% below 1990 level. And we did that together with developing our clean energy and climate plan for 2030. That's our action plan for what we need to do today, tomorrow, all through the 2020s to ensure that we can achieve net zero in 2050. That plan outlines emissions reductions that can achieve between 45 and 48% of reductions below 1990 levels. Some of those things are things that are not wholly in our control, but we expect we're excited to see what the new federal administration does. And there are certain things that the federal administration can do and should do for battling climate change that will have real results here in Massachusetts. As it says on the slide, our Clean Energy and Climate Plan is available for public comment through February 22nd, and stay tuned for more information, and I'm sure Claire can get it to you about webinars and Q&A sessions to help gather your comments and engage with you on that action plan for 2030. I want to end really quickly with on something of a personal note. Recognizing this webinar is being presented and recorded at the end of a few incredibly emotional and stressful weeks for the nation. And as we head into a long weekend that honors one of our country's greatest champions of humanity, of equity, of justice, and importantly, of change, of action. So these two quotes are posted on my desk, or by my desk, I think with tape, my desk at EEA in Boston that I haven't seen for a year, because they give me strength and focus and resolve to do this work when I get tired, and sometimes I feel overwhelmed by the challenges we face. But the roadmap gives me hope and helps. On top, Martin Luther King Jr., the time is always right to do what is right, and that's what you're seeing here in Massachusetts. We are taking action, we are leading, and now is the time, and the 2020s are a critical time. That is something we know and agree on. And this other one is more recent and less well known, but one of the real climate leaders in the EU, Dan Jorgensen, reminds us that our task is to do what we know we have to do and figure out, to come together and not just critique and say, I see uncertainty here, I see uncertainty there, but what about this? It's to come together and work towards solutions to make the necessary possible. Again, next steps, here's the other website to look for. Please, I'm glad so many people have read the roadmap. Keep asking questions about it, keep reading it, keep using it as a resource, and please engage with us on the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2030. That's at www.mass.gov/2030 CECP. We have an open public comment period. We're looking for public comment, and look out for more information on 2 hosted Q&A webinars about that action plan. I see Han clicking in, and I will stop talking and hand it over to my team to help us with the question and answers.
Thank you, David. So for those who have submitted questions, thank you so much. There are a lot of questions. You could still submit questions now if you would like. There's that Q&A button at the bottom of the screen there. You can click on that and submit your questions. Since we have received a lot of questions thus far, I'm going to try my best to go through them and consolidate some questions here, grouping some questions because they're very similar. Just so you all know, though, a bunch of questions came in that pertains to very specific aspects that are already answered in the technical report. So I would encourage you all to go on the website mass.gov/2050 roadmap and select the technical report that goes into a little detail about like the jobs, what the job analysis indicates, or what the land use assumptions and definitions are. So just a little tidbit there. All right, so David, we have a question about the role of the IAC, Global Warming Solutions Act Implementation Advisory Committees, policy recommendations. How did those policy recommendations get incorporated into the roadmap or into our process developing the roadmap?
Yeah, that's a great question. For those of you who don't know or who may not know, the Global Warming Solutions Act is our climate law that was passed in 2008 and which guides pretty much 100% of my daily job, but it guides our climate action here in Massachusetts. The GWSA, that law, specified or required that the secretary convene an advisory committee, the Implementation Advisory Committee, or the IAC. And that committee was formed, I believe, sometime in maybe 2008 or 2009. And we have been interacting with the IAC for the entire 2 years of this report or this analysis. We have engaged with the IAC on largely around our policy goals and what policies and pieces they were interested in and thought needed to be studied in the roadmap analysis. We also convened a technical advisory group for the roadmap analysis itself, made up of leading academics from Massachusetts universities. And we hired some of the best technical experts we could find across the United States to help us define the analysis itself, which I will admit, there are hundreds of assumptions about the future, about the cost of an electric vehicle, about the cost of natural gas today or tomorrow, that go into a complex modeling exercise like this. So we engaged, the IAC was our primary stakeholder group, if you will, throughout this process. And then a little over a year ago, we convened a public stakeholder group around scenario development to try and inform. I showed you those 8 scenarios we explored, and we asked a wide group of public folks, regular folks and advocates and experts to come and join us in Boston. And we had a stakeholder session to work on what we should be looking for as we do this long range analysis.
Great. And then we received a lot of questions about the roadmap report and the climate bill, S2995. Could you provide some comments on that, David? Some folks are asking, like, what's next, or how is the roadmap being implemented without the roadmap bill, etc.
Sure, and we are, so the roadmap is being implemented already, and as I indicated earlier, we published a clean energy and climate plan for 2030 that lays out real world, very specific implementation actions for the 2020s to achieve 45% in 2030 and to be on track for net zero in 2050. And really, it's worth pausing that the charge that the law gave to the secretary in this regard was to choose a 2030 limit that maximizes our ability to achieve net zero. So there are a range of percentages, a range of reductions that we could see occurring in 2030 and still see us making net zero, but our job was to maximize it. Our job was to find out what percentage gives us the best chance, and that's a multilateral analysis, quite honestly, that involves cost. It involves where we are today, where we think we can be in 2025, when 5 years have gone by, where we can be in 2030, and where we need to be in 2035, 2040, and on. So we are taking action on that, and the governor is deeply committed, and as is EEA, to engaging on on many elements of the legislation, and doing it starting right now. So we're engaged on this. I think there's a lot of overlap. That's what I heard from the governor. That's what I understand from my conversations with the governors, that we agree on quite a lot. And we also agree, as this report and the Clean Energy and Climate Plan have demonstrated in concrete ways with concrete numbers and concrete policies, that we are committed to action today that will enable us to achieve net zero.
Great. So now we're going down to the weeds a little bit. The next question mentioned that the report didn't explain too well how agriculture emissions was addressed, and whether or not it was addressed in the non-energy sector or in the land use sector. So could you explain a little more what part of the agricultural emissions were incorporated into non-energy and what was incorporated into the land use sector.
Sure. I apologize if it wasn't clear. My slide, our agricultural emissions are industrial emissions around the production of food. And they were accounted for in the non-energy sector as we defined it. So none of these things, you could make up whatever sector you want, but that's where we took those emissions into account. So my slide that had 2 wastewater treatment plants also had 2 lovely cows. So that's where agricultural emissions were accounted for. They're important, but really something that the roadmap, I think, does a good job of explaining, and I hope, is that getting to net zero is really in a lot of ways a question of scale. We have to really look at where our emissions are coming from in bulk and figure out how to reduce them in bulk. And those are overwhelmingly from our homes and our cars. Those are the things that have to change no matter what. What we found is that we could apply best practices to try and reduce tough to reduce emissions like agricultural emissions, like wastewater treatment emissions. We will do our best and to maintain where we are or do better whenever there's an ability to reduce emissions. But we do see that that is likely one of the places where emissions will remain all the way through to 2050, as long as we are still treating our wastewater and producing food, which I assume on both we will be. And then there is the possibility to sequester carbon in natural and working lands, and that's addressed in the carbon sequestration piece of our analysis.
Great. Another question related to that sector is, can you clarify what will be expected of forests and how would this affect forest management?
It's a great question. And this is really, anyone who loves forests should love the roadmap report, because this is the first time that forests have come into the climate equation in a quantifiable, real way. It's tough to say what will be expected of forests because 2/3 of our forests are owned by private landowners, mostly by families. So we have forests and we have forests. We have parks and protected forests that the state owns, and those are already being sustainably managed, and we're always working for better ways to increase the health and viability and ecosystem services. Our forests help provide clean water. They provide ecosystem for the wildlife we love in the state. They provide a place for recreation. They can also pull carbon out of the air, which is also really important. So we are working already with neighboring states, which is a theme. If you haven't heard it yet, it's a theme that we can't do this alone, or it's unlikely that we can do it well unless we're working with our neighbors. We're already working with our neighbors to come up with ways of measuring and incentivizing and a marketplace likely for forest owners to provide this service to the public. And so I don't know that we're yet expecting anything from our forests, but we're sure wanting to invite our forest owners to manage sustainably and to preserve these as a resource for us all.
Great. One question that just came in that maybe you could address quickly, David, in this sector is the role of salt marshes. Was that included in the land sector analysis?
I believe it was. We'll have to double check me on in the technical report. But we looked at forests, marshes, open space, agricultural land, grasslands, and pretty much all of our natural resources. And again, overall, the story there is one of scale. We already have some of the best wetlands protection enforcement and rules and enforcement in the country. We are actively restoring wetlands and marshes. And it's an area where there's obviously a huge intersection between people living and working on the coasts and the marsh areas. So we, and I believe this is in our Clean Energy and Climate Plan, protecting and continuing to protect and restore salt marshes is absolutely something we want and need to do, and will be continuing to pursue as we get to net zero.
Great. We have a couple of questions clarifying terminologies, and I would direct people to the appendix in the roadmap, as well as more of the technical report. But David, maybe if you want to just quickly, carbon neutral biofuels. What do we mean by carbon neutral biofuels, and what do we mean by decarbonized gas?
Sure. Carbon neutral biofuels. It is possible to, like trees, all plants that photosynthesize, that have green leaves and look to the sun to power their own internal plant engines, they all pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in order to do their biological thing and grow. So as plants grow, whether it's a salt marsh grass, whether it's a tree, whether it's switchgrass, bamboo, they pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And those plants can be, some people refer to them as biomass, biological mass stuff. When they're harvested, they can be eaten, or they can also be, through various chemistry processes, they can be sort of distilled down into a biofuel. So the one that maybe a lot of people would be familiar with is corn-based ethanol. 10% of our gasoline in Massachusetts by federal law is blended with corn-based ethanol. So this is essentially gasoline that is made from corn. So for every gallon you put in your, or for every 10 gallons you put in your car, only 9 of them are fossil gas, and 1 of them is corn ethanol. So the possibility exists. People can make biofuels and not be careful. People can lie about them. There's lots of ways to do things wrong, but we know that we can make truly carbon neutral biofuels, and that they have an important role to play in a net zero economy. Decarbonized gas is a similar product. The way it was actually modeled in our analysis was natural gas, or methane, fossil methane gas, blended with a zero carbon gas product. So like corn ethanol for gasoline, you can take non-fossil things, you can blend with hydrogen, or you could, which is a gas, a naturally occurring gas, or we could create gas from essentially methane from corn, grass, from biomass products. And then you can either make a liquid fuel with it or a gaseous fuel. If you blend them, you have a lower carbon combustible fuel. If you blend it to 100% or use it exclusively, you have a zero carbon biogas or other combustible fuel.
Great. So we're going to move away from the sector, land sector, a little bit, and we're going to talk about a couple questions came in about equity. So one question says, how would the Commonwealth ensure that low and moderate income families are included in an equitable manner while staying on pace to achieve net zero by 2050?
That is a great question, and part of that question is in our clean energy and climate plan discussion. But the part that I really want to focus on today is the part I already mentioned, and that's looking for multiple options like we did, developing as many options as we can possibly develop now that are not kicking the can down the road options, but real credible options for achieving the goals we have, to open up the space for creativity, for innovation, and for deployment of options that make sense where they make sense, rather than forcing one size fits all because we like it or it's easy to talk about, forcing everybody to do something. So that's one piece of it. The other is I talked a lot about pace, and that pace is the key to affordability. And we understand that, everybody's going to have to make compromise. None of this is perfectly easy to do. But we think the bedrock, the cornerstone of doing this transition of getting to net zero equitably is to make sure that it's done affordably, that we have as many options as we can, that we don't drive cost up just to drive a certain resource out, that instead we keep our eyes on the prize and we aim for 2050 and make sure that we're going to 2050 on pace and on scale. It will be a challenge for all of us, rich or poor, white or black, to make this transition. Everybody is going to need to do something with their home. Everybody's going to need to do something with their car. None of that is easy right now for anybody in the Commonwealth. It's our job to make it doable for everybody, to bring everybody along, and EEA and this administration are absolutely committed to that work.
Great. A question came in about the role of natural gas in the roadmap. Can you elaborate a little bit about the what the study has found in terms of the role of natural gas?
Sure. And I know there's a lot of emotion and concern about natural gas, and that's understandable. We found a couple things. One is the obvious that I think everybody agrees on, that the problem that's causing climate change is burning fossil fuels. Those roughly come in 3 flavors: coal, oil, and natural gas, just to be simple. So we know that to get to net zero, we can't keep burning any fossil fuel at volume, at scale, to power our economy. That's what this whole thing is about, moving economy that's built on fossil fuels to one that is not built on fossil fuels. In that hierarchy, and in doing this affordably and doing it equitably, the place to start is with the most carbon dense fuel, and that's coal. And Massachusetts has been leading. We are taking action. We have shut down our coal plants. There are states in this country that are still building coal plants that are going in the opposite direction. That's not us. So we've gotten rid of our coal-fired electric power. The next worst fuel are liquid petroleum products, gasoline for our cars, diesel for our trucks and buses. That's where the biggest bang for the buck is. Burning oil to heat a home. That is the most emissions you can get in a bad way for heating a home right now. So one thing we found is that as we transition, the last thing we should turn off is gas. It's also true that we found we need to start turning it down now. And that's clearly stated in the roadmap. But right now, the transition we're looking at is a transition of, like I said, or showed on the slides, millions of new vehicles, millions of new homes. That cannot be done overnight. Even at top speed, it cannot be done overnight. So there's a duration here that even as we're charging ahead full speed, not everybody's home gets a contractor at its door tomorrow. And so we'll continue to use natural gas, we'll continue to use gasoline as we get more and more EVs on the road. So there's a good parallel. We don't see a role for gasoline to fuel engines in 2050, but we do see its continued use in 2021 and 2022, less and less each year as we bring on more and more EVs. And the story is very similar, if not the same, for natural gas. We had some interesting findings too. One is that to achieve net zero, we don't necessarily need to get rid of 100% of all gas use. And that really bothers some people, but this could be used, say, to power a backup generator at a hospital. That's a pretty socially high value use for an incredibly small and infrequent use of natural gas. It could be used to power an industrial facility that provides 1,000 jobs for Massachusetts or for the region. And if we can achieve our goal without shutting those factories down and closing those hospitals, we think that's a good way to go. So the role of natural gas looks like it plays a role today, like a lot of other fossil fuels, and the roadmap analysis shows us using less and less and less and less of it every year between now and 2050 until essentially it will feel like none is being used because no one has a home furnace maybe, or no one has a gasoline powered car, but there'll likely be a few small uses that are still within the emissions budget and still allow us to achieve our goal.
And something that's a follow-up question is, what about the role of gas utilities? How would that change?
That's a great question, and I invite you to log into the Department of Public Utilities file room and look for the 20-80 docket. That's an ongoing investigation right now into the future role for natural gas utilities. The DPU has invited the utilities to examine the roadmap, examine the Clean Energy and Climate Plan as it stands today, and to describe what their business model looks like in a world where we still need to operate our gas systems safely every day that they're operational, which means today and tomorrow and for many years to come, but we'll be delivering less and less gas, and we assume fewer and fewer people will be a gas customer as we go forward.
Great. We're going to move on to the transportation sector.
Great.
But we got a question about the cost of new electric cars in 2030. How is the state projecting the cost out to 2035, and will it be affordable for EVs?
Is the question, how are we projecting it, or what number are we projecting it to be?
I'll read the exact question. Does the state think that the cost for a new electric car in 2035 will be affordable?
I don't know that the state has an answer, but I think they will be affordable. And our analysis indicates that they're likely to be very affordable. And one of the reasons we think that is that they are close to affordable, if not affordable today. So there aren't a lot of EV models available, unfortunately. And that is one thing that we are in lockstep with the state of California and hopefully the new federal administration on requiring that 100% of light duty vehicles sold in Massachusetts by 2035 will be zero emissions vehicles. We need to show that demand and send that signal to ensure that the manufacturers know we're serious so that these cars show up in our showrooms. But even today, there's cost and there's cost. So again, remember I talked about investment. We see over and over, and zero emission vehicles is one place where we see that upfront investment leads to overall savings. What do I mean by that? When you buy a car today, you have to then pay insurance, mandatory, state requires it. Every year you operate the car, and you have to fuel the car, and you have to maintain the car. Regular oil, regular checkups, new tires. And so there's the cost to purchase the vehicle, and there's a cost to operate the vehicle. Right now, the cost of electric vehicles, even though there aren't that many on the market, is almost comparable to the upfront purchase cost of a similar sedan or crossover. I know I've been looking at the RAV4 plug-in hybrid. I don't know if my family can afford one, but the costs are pretty similar. But what I do know is that it costs less to operate those vehicles year after year after year. It costs less per mile to drive them. And so overall, the total cost is almost even or close to even now. And what we're observing is innovation and costs coming down. If anybody could watch the World Series despite where Mookie Betts was playing, General Motors announced an electric Humvee. Not my choice of vehicle, but wow, the largest truck in America is going electric, and that's happening next year or the year after. So that market is changing, and I do have confidence that electric vehicles will be affordable by 2035.
Great. This one relates to more policies, but I think perhaps you can address it. How does the roadmap envision the role for carbon pricing in transitioning the transportation sector and other sectors away from fossil fuel?
Yeah, that's not really a roadmap question. So I would invite that question. Please engage with us on the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. And I'm not avoiding the question in any way. That's the place to talk about that policy implementation. What the roadmap was doing was showing, again, remember, we are aiming for what we need, which is a net zero 2050, and working our way backward. So what we learned from the roadmap is how many cars and trucks need to be zero emissions vehicles by when. And we see how and where and about what costs we think we could produce hydrogen or biofuel or electricity, clean electricity to fuel them. So we know the what and the when of what we need. The Clean Energy and Climate Plan, there's a lot of work. How do we make that, now that we know what we need and when we need it, how do we make it affordable and available and actually do it? And that's where pricing comes in. But as I'm sure many people here know, Governor Baker has been leading the region and really the whole country on implementing the Transportation Climate Initiative to ensure we have the ability to invest in clean transportation solutions. And that involves pricing in the transportation sector. So join us for the discussion in a few weeks, in the coming weeks, around that in the Clean Energy and Climate Plan.
Okay, we have a question back to the power sector. How important is grid power storage to providing reliable service?
Great technical wonky question, the kind that I like. Grid power storage. What we found in our analysis, and what we did was we let resources compete on price and on performance in the model. So again, this is modeling, we're not predicting the future, but we ran a lot of scenarios and we wanted to let all these resources compete. Storage, grid storage is one version of that. Demand side, distributed storage is another version of that. Transmission is another resource. What we found is that the most likely the lowest cost clean grid has grid scale battery storage or pumped hydro storage, which we have on our system right now, but not that much more than we have today. And that surprises a lot of people when I say it. It was a finding that I didn't know going in. What we found provides the balancing, people like to call it. People think of a renewable portfolio as unbalanced, or that they'll say things like this: the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, right? What we found is the best way to deal with that variability, which is very predictable. We know when in the day the sun doesn't shine, and we have really good weather forecasts as to when the wind will blow. But to deal with that variability, the least cost option is to interconnect with our neighbors, so that across a geography from New York to New Brunswick, from Rhode Island to Quebec, we're sharing clean resources over that mega region, so that local variability, the solar, the panel on your rooftop getting covered by a cloud, isn't seen by the system because there's a solar panel somewhere else that's not covered by the cloud. So most of that variability is taken care of by transmission interconnection and by having a diverse portfolio: onshore wind, offshore wind, solar, hydro, all these different resources. We do need some grid scale storage. What we found is we need this new thing, which is really interesting, is that we did a lot of weather analysis. And in the years we examined, and we'll do more of this, this is what building a clean grid will require, this kind of work. We found that sometimes there's very little offshore wind. It's one of the most reliable renewable resources on the planet, but some days, and any sailor will tell you this, some days you're out on the water and the wind just isn't blowing. There aren't many days. We found in a couple different weather years, historically 12 to 15 days like that out of 365 days. And sometimes they were grouped in 1 day, half a day, or up to 3 days. And it's those periods when, if we're going to have about 60% of our power come from offshore wind, that we'll need something to fill the gap. Storage can provide that role. We also found that if we maintain our cleanest gas plants that are already built and are already paid for, essentially, and in those very few hours we turn them on with burning gas or burning a gas blended with hydrogen or biogas, that they could also provide that service.
Great. So we have about 6 more minutes. I have 2 more questions for you, David.
I'll try. I'll stop talking so much. Sorry. Don't ask about the power sector. I like those answers too much. Sorry.
Well, this next question is related to the power sector. We have several questions that came in regarding the land use implications of solar, could you speak a little more about what the roadmap says, the analysis
Sure.
is in terms of solar?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really not just a question about solar, but I will speak to solar. It's really a question about energy infrastructure, full stop. We need a lot of new clean power. We need a lot of offshore wind. We need as much onshore wind as we can get. We need a lot of solar power, and we need transmission to connect them. And so all of those resources take space, if you will, and maybe that's an obvious conclusion. Offshore wind requires putting, I call it sticks in the water, putting new structures in the water where to date fishermen haven't seen those structures, where whales haven't had to deal with them, right? So there's a lot of interesting and delicate and thoughtful work that needs to go on around siting all of this energy infrastructure. And again, transmission is maybe one of the most important pieces of that. Around solar specifically, we knew that a lot of people are concerned about the siting of solar power or solar energy. So please take a look at our DER breakthrough, our distributed energy resources breakthrough scenario, where we essentially forced the model to put solar on virtually every roof that the National Renewable Energy Lab, those smart scientists in Golden, Colorado, have estimated could host solar, so a south-facing or a not covered by trees roof in Massachusetts, and they determined these looking at satellite imagery and things. The model put maximum solar deployment on rooftops, and what we found is we still need more clean power than that. That isn't enough. We still need the offshore wind. We still need the transmission. Just having rooftop solar isn't enough power to power our economy today or in 2050. So the model looked for more power, and the next least cost resource was ground mounted solar. So it built out several thousand acres of ground mount solar. So I think our real challenge now is if we are together on achieving net zero, then we all are agreeing that we need a lot of clean resources. We need transmission. We can't pull any one of these legs from the table or it will collapse. So then we have a challenge to figure out where to best site that. What land is the best land to put that on? Where is the best place to put our next 2 or 3 transmission lines? Where is the best place to put our offshore wind? And how do we arrange that so that our fishermen can thrive and our whales are safe? So we know there's enough land to do it. We know there's enough space to do it well. We know we don't have to cover any of our protected forests or parks with solar panels or transmission lines, but we do have to find out where we're going to place it, because this is really a key for all of us reaching this goal that we have and share.
All right. So the next question, which I thought was going to be the last, but there's a good one for another one. So I'll say this question: what's the role of hydrogen in transportation decarbonization,
Sure.
and how can the hydrogen industry get more involved in the plan?
Yeah, we see a really great opportunity for hydrogen and a great industry. We hope it grows, and I'm sure we'll work to help grow. Remember that some of the toughest vehicles to decarbonize are those big vehicles that have very specific uses, and which so far no expert thinks that electric batteries are the best way to do that. It's either a liquid, some people call it a drop-in fuel, biofuel, or it's hydrogen, potentially a hydrogen fuel cell, or potentially burning the hydrogen in some sort of combustion engine. There's also this nice connection between a renewable powered electric grid when there is a lot of sun and wind. Wonderful. We have free electricity, have more electricity, it's cleaner than we've ever had it. And it's just the earth is giving it to us in wind and sun all at the same time on a beautiful, sunny, windy fall day. In days like that, we can either turn off our solar and our wind because we don't need it for our computers and our electric vehicles, or we could use it to create green hydrogen. They call it hydrogen that's made not from natural gas, but from the electricity and the water and splitting water. So that's a really amazing cost-saving dynamic that can get us low-cost hydrogen for transportation fuel and keep costs down, really maximize the value of the offshore wind we're building. So that's a really exciting part of this future, and it's something that's we saw as cost effective in every scenario we looked at.
Great. And the last question to close us out on is, given the new Democratic administration, how do you see better progress in meeting these goals in Massachusetts?
Yeah, I mean, we're excited for the future. We're excited for the future here in Massachusetts. We're working with states across Massachusetts, as well as the states in New England have worked together ever, potentially, or at least in the last 10 to 15 years. And we're looking forward to working with the new administration. There are pieces of this transition that decisive and clear federal action if taken, will make it more cost effective, more affordable, generate more jobs, and have it all happen faster than any one state can do alone. So we're already in dialogue with our congressional delegation about potential changes in the future at the federal level. I know the Secretary is talking to the new climate director for President-elect Biden, Gina McCarthy, later today. So we're in contact, and we're excited for the opportunity ahead.
Great, thank you. We have lots of questions, and I tried to get to as many questions as possible by bundling them, but I recognize that there are some questions that have been addressed. Feel free to email us at gwsa@mass.gov. I think that's it. Thank you all for joining our webinar. I think we already said before that the recordings will be posted on mass.gov/2050 roadmap. After this, it'll be available in multiple languages. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. And please join us on the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. Read it, engage. We're open for public comment, and really looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Wait, why don't I do a little plug for that? So the first webinar is scheduled for a Wednesday, I believe, the 28th, from 10 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. to 11:30, I think. I hope I get that right. And then the webinar number 2 is scheduled for a Saturday morning from 10:30 to 12. Hope you all can join us then.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.